So I'd like to start off with just, this is going to be a very generalized overview of the financial processes that are typically used to implement solar. The goal is really to understand the financial incentives and comparing those financial approaches to implementing solar on a project. So we'll talk, first we've just pretty much had the introduction. We're going to go through current and historical PV costs, rebates and incentives that are out there, and then different types of ownership, the power purchase agreements or PPAs, leases, direct ownership, and then we'll get into open discussion and questions. So PV systems, the cost per watt for residential and commercial is different and continues to change over time, for sure. A couple things impact this. Of course, the system size and the complexity of the system impacts cost a lot. Typical home system, it's very simple. It's on a simple roof and very small and pretty straightforward. But since it is such a small system, its cost on a per watt or kilowatt basis can actually be higher than a very large system, utility scale system, where you've just got that economy of scale working for you that can really drive the cost down. Those are typically your lowest cost systems. The more complex the system is, of course, the higher the cost. If you implement batteries, or if you have some fancy structure such as a carport canopy, then the costs go up considerably because you have the addition of the footings and the structure and all the various parts and pieces that impact that cost. Obviously, the lowest cost systems are going to be the ones where the solar is the primary structure, the primary piece of the whole project. As soon as you implement carports, as soon as you implement fancy, systems that might have to be on a roof because of structural upgrades or something, that of course starts to drive up the cost of the solar. One of the key things that has really impacted solar growth in certain areas more than others is the utility energy rates. Obviously, in order for solar to be competitive, it has to be competitive with what the local utility energy rates are. And in parts of the country, California is a great example, where utility rates are a whole lot higher than here. Typically, you're seeing 18 cents to 32 cents a kilowatt hour versus the 11 or so that you have here. Has a huge impact, of course, on the finances and the return on investment and for the whole solar system. So that's one of the reasons why California has been at the forefront of implementing solar in this country, because it makes sense. Other parts of the country, Florida, Texas, where you've got cheap power, which is a great thing, it's a harder sell and adds to the challenges. However, that's where really the incentives, rebates, and other things make it possible and make it very economically feasible to start implementing solar. So as solar prices come down and continue to come down, that makes markets with lower energy rates much more, not effective, but much more able to make justifiable sense to implement the solar. Of course, as PV reaches par with utility rates, especially with incentives, then the PV growth will increase. So a couple graphs here that just sort of shows what that's looked like over time. And you look in the early 80s and everything, solar was quite expensive on a kilowatt hour or on a kilowatt basis. And over the years here, you can see the cost has continued to come down. As we get down here, it's almost, you almost can't see it because it's gotten so low in terms of its overall cost. And you see the same sort of line here that's represented here. And you'll notice there's some difference. This one's just on the price of crystalline silicon for the photovoltaic cells. This is for solar systems in general. So you see a little bit of discrepancy, but the trend is the same. The costs over the years have dropped dramatically on solar. At the same time, the yellow bars indicates the PV production. The number of systems going in, the actual amount of solar panels being produced, everything else has increased dramatically as the cost comes down. This is a fairly natural curve, and you would expect that to occur. The challenges going forward, this is a little bit dated, it only goes to '08, but the challenges going forward are, we're reaching extremely low prices on the solar, particularly solar modules now. We're seeing them down 62 cents a watt, which is crazy compared to the, $8, $10 a watt we were looking at that not that many years ago. So there's not too much more room to go down. Now, there is still room for efficiencies in terms of installation and processes, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday, to help manage the whole cost as low as possible. But really we're starting to see, as energy prices increase, as efficiencies improve, really starting to see the PV production shoot up. And that's a good thing. So we start to look at, all right, what rebates and incentives are out there that helps make solar more feasible and more easy to justify, easier for homeowners, business owners, governments, and utilities to implement solar. And so you start looking at the various incentives and rebates. Typically you have federal tax credits, you have state credits, Encore rebates, or utility rebates, I should say, but Encore being the primary utility in this area. And accelerated depreciation are some of your key rebates and incentives. Now you notice financial incentives for solar PV, and you look at Texas, and it's one of the states that doesn't actually have a state financial incentive. But that doesn't mean there are no financial incentives here. The utilities do, some of the counties do, a lot of the cities do. Just the state itself does not.
Tony? Actually, it's not entirely correct. We don't have a direct incentive in the sense that it's a rebate back to the owner for the installation of the system. But the state does have a tax law exemption for any residential appraisal increase that may result from the implementation or installation of solar equipment on a home. Very specifically, it says that if you install, let's say, a photovoltaic system on your home, and as a direct result of that installation, they appraise your home at a higher value, that increase is exempt from additional taxes on the home. So you can enjoy the benefit of having a higher appraised value, but you do benefit from not having the taxes imposed on it as a result.
That is correct. Absolutely right. And I think we'll touch on that also. No, I appreciate that. PV rebates and incentives. So there is a 30% federal tax credit. You do have the advantage, if you're a business or a company, to take advantage of the accelerated depreciation. There's a lot of discussion on RECs, renewable energy credits, and the ownership, who owns those. And that's different in almost every utility in every state across the country. Some utilities require, if you put in solar, they require that they own the RECs. Other utilities, you can own the RECs yourself. What's the value of a REC? Well, that varies all over the place too. We're typically finding it's about 2 cents a kilowatt hour on average, but that fluctuates all over the place. There are markets being set up to trade RECs. The idea to think about RECs is that if you own the RECs, particularly if you're a lead building, if you're going for a lead rating, you need to own those RECs in order to gain the right to claim the green energy. And so that becomes an issue with certain areas where, El Paso Electric, for example, EP, they own the RECs no matter what. And it makes it very difficult when you're going for those lead points and everything in terms of how you work that out.
Tony, sorry,
Yes.
I have a question. What does REC stand for? Is it a credit or?
Renewable energy credits.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
good
right,
question.
thank you.
So if you go to, there are a lot of sites out there that list all the rebates, incentives. Desire is a well-known one and has a good list. And it's actually a fairly extensive list of credits, rebates, and incentives for this area, for Texas as a whole. It lists by whether it's a U.S. Rebate or incentive, a state. It breaks it down a little bit. And it does talk about the tax credit, the 30%, includes the property tax exemption that was just mentioned, accelerated cost recovery, the depreciation that we'll go into. Encore, of course, is one of many has one of many rebate programs within the state. You'll notice a lot of cities have their own rebate programs. City of Sunset, City of San Marcos. You see it all throughout. Austin Energy is a residential solar loan program, and so you really need to know what area you are and what's available for you to take advantage. And it differs everywhere you go within the state. And so you Go Solar, for example, probably is very well aware of what is available out there in any region that they're working in, and most of your PV providers are a great resource. They know what's available to take advantage of for any project. So we're going to look at a few of the different PV financing options that are out there. Probably the most common is the owner purchased. That's pretty straightforward. The owner owns it. It requires your own capital to purchase it. Sure, you can borrow the money, but the point is it's yours. You're financing it. Typically on these, the owner is responsible for all the O&M. The owner monetizes the rebates and incentives, typically. Not always. Some of the rebates work through the PV provider. So if you have a PV provider, they will be paid the incentive, but that is, how do you want to say? That is, it comes back to the owner in terms of a lower cost. And then for private or taxable entities, this is generally the most cost-effective way to go because they can take full advantage of all the incentives and rebates. This is not a common approach for cities, government agencies, because obviously they cannot take advantage of those credits, tax credits and everything, because they don't pay taxes. Where it does make sense for government agencies to actually outright own projects is when they have a grant or some other source, when there's ARA funding, for example, those types of things where then, they've got the money to buy it. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about a power purchase agreement, or a PPA. Very common term used throughout most of the country for basically a third-party owner to own the system. Basically what it is, you have an agreement with, again, a third party, typically an LLC, to own, operate, finance, install, and maintain that PV system. Basically, you, as the property owner, don't own the system at all in any shape or form. Typically, you don't touch it, nothing. It's just on your land. And the way the deal is structured, you, as the property owner, are just purchasing the energy that the system produces. You don't own the system, you never own the system, you don't ever have any stake in the system. As long as the system's working, you're just buying whatever power it produces. If it doesn't work, if it fails for some period of time, that's a loss to the third party not to the owner. Typically, it'll be set as a fixed or escalating rate. In other words, it may start off at 10 cents a kilowatt hour for the first year and slowly ramp up over the 20-year, typically a 20-year period for a PPA, and ramp up as the term goes on. The idea being typically to be a few cents lower than what the utility rates are so that there's an advantage for doing it in the first place. Some of the advantages to going this route is it requires absolutely no capital investment at all. As a government agency, you just say, okay, here's the land, you do it, you put it in, you incur all the costs and everything else, and we'll just buy the energy. So that's kind of nice for the landowner. Again, this is advantageous to the government agencies because this is a way of sort of monetizing those tax credits and accelerated depreciation and everything else, since they cannot take advantage of those otherwise. Typically, PPAs are for systems 250 kW and larger, but we're seeing them for smaller as well. And even in the residential market, the Solar City model and stuff, it sort of follows this approach. And so it can work at all different sizes, but typically it's the larger systems. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
The 250 kW, is that, how is that in terms of building size?
Oh. So a 250 kW system, for example, probably wouldn't fit on the roof of this building. It'd be close. I'm not quite sure what the square footage of your roof is here, but
I can give an example. Our array at the airport is 186 kW, and it's 737 panels. So 250 kW panel would probably be 850, something like that. It'd be very large.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to run through a quick comparison of if you were to finance a system by just outright ownership versus doing a power purchase agreement, just so you can sort of see how it's structured. This is very simplified. It does not take into effect degradation of system over time, doesn't take into effect rising energy costs over time, but it just gives an overall picture of kind of how it works. So for this example, we're going to assume a 1 megawatt solar array, which could be a ground-mounted system, for example. 1 megawatt, let's assume a system cost of $3,500,000. That's $3,500 a kW. Assume a current electric cost of 11 cents. A system of this size, 1 megawatt in this area, will produce, give or take, 1,700,000 kilowatt hours a year. The value of that energy, 1,700,000 at 11 cents a kilowatt hour, $187,000 a year. We're going to assume a life of the system of 30 years. So with that, we'll just assume a purchase, an outright purchase. And to look at that, really what we're looking at then is, we cannot take advantage of 30% tax credit. This is a government system. We cannot take advantage of the 5-year depreciation. So really what we're looking at is the system cost divided by the value of the solar energy. And that equals the number of years to recoup that investment. Again, a very simplified way of doing it. That works out to our original $3.5 million cost, $187,000 value of solar energy, works out to about a 19-year payback. Most people aren't going to do a 19-year payback. It's a long time. Now, granted, the system has a 30-year life, but still, that's a heck of a payback. Over the 30-year life of the system, it's going to produce about $5.6 million worth of energy. That's a set flat 11 cents a kilowatt hour over the 30 years. We know that's not quite what's going to happen, but for the purposes of this, we'll stick with that. So 5.6 million on a cost of 3.5 million. So basically you end up $2 million ahead at the end of the 30-year period by doing this. So yes, it pays back. Yes, you come out ahead. And your total cost of energy works out to about 7 cents a kilowatt hour over that 30-year period, which is under the current rate that you're paying. So basically you're locked in at 7 cents for the next 30 years. That's actually not too bad. You know the cost of energy is going to go up. But it's still a 19-year payback. This doesn't take into consideration the cost of the money the cost of that 35 million or 3.5 million that you started with. So if we look at it under a power purchase agreement, what's the same thing start to look like? So in this, the third party finances the whole thing, and they can take advantage of both the tax credits and the accelerated depreciation that we had described before. So 30%, the 5-year accelerated depreciation is worth approximately another $1 million, a little more than $1 million at a 30% tax rate. So this third party has to have a tax appetite, first of all. So then it looks like this. You have the system cost, you have the tax credit, and the depreciation. So you take the system cost minus the tax credit minus the depreciation over the value of that solar energy, and that equals your return. So that's the $3.5 million minus $1 million or so for the 30% tax credit, another $1 million or so over a 5-year period for the depreciation, divided by your 170,000 equals basically an 8-year payback. So that's much shorter than 19. So that looks pretty good. Now you're seeing the advantage of a third party being able to monetize those tax credits and depreciation and bring the overall cost of the system down. So in this scenario, the system's going to generate the same $5 million in electricity over the 30 years, but on an investment, a finalized total investment of only $1.4 million, or only 3 cents per kilowatt hour over the 30-year period. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get it at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. On top of that, of course, they're going to wrap in their profits, their cost of doing business, their O&M, all these things. But it starts to show the picture that by going this route, you can really drop the overall cost of the system a lot to a government agency and make it very palatable. Another piece of this is you'll see what's called a flip, very common related to PPAs. And that's basically at the end of year 6, once all these accelerated depreciation has been monetized by the LLC, those investors want to get out because they want to get into other investments where they can take advantage of the tax credits. And at this point, you can't because you've already done that. So they get out, bring in new investors who aren't looking for that tax appetite and continue on with that PPA for the life of the system. That flip and everything else doesn't really affect the government agency that is buying the power. It's pretty much a behind-the-scenes process. But that's a very common thing that you'll see. So hopefully that makes sense.
When they do the flip, do they actually give the system over to the government entity?
No, typically not. Typically the LLC will still own the system, or it'll flip to another LLC, but it'll be a different tax appetite. In other words, once it's flipped, they're not looking for the same level of depreciation.
No, I understand that part of it,
Okay.
but wouldn't the system have been paid off at that point in time?
Typically it has.
But there is the opportunity for that prior LLC to say to the government entity, here, you now own the system, you now have to do the operation and maintenance, you now have responsibility. So there is that possibility, though.
There is that possibility that is typically worked out before you sign the contract. In other words, you know in advance when that system becomes yours or available for purchase. It's a good point. A lot of government agencies, you don't know, particularly in an airport, for example, you've got a lot of development going on. You don't necessarily want to lock up this roof or this piece of land for 30 years with no option to redevelop or do something different with it. So you're absolutely right. You'll have buyout points throughout the life of that PPA where you can take over the ownership of it. So some pros and cons between the PPA. Of course, no capital is required by the client. The client can focus on its mission, whatever that might be, rather than being in the energy production business. Typically no system maintenance at all by the client. That's all done under the PPA. The client only pays for actual power produced. This is an advantage because if you actually own the system and it goes down, well, you're not getting anything for your investment. Whereas with this, you have no investment, and so you're just paying for the power that it produces. Cost of power is generally slightly lower than utility rates. We've seen power purchase agreements that are considerably lower than utility rates. We've seen them higher than utility rates where they're doing the project for reasons other than just cost savings. But typically when it's competitively bid, we'll find that the goal, of course, is to come in a little bit below the utility rate to make it palatable, if you will, to the agencies. The more parties you have bidding on it, typically, of course, the better pricing you're going to find. And then, of course, the rebates and incentives are monetized into the PPA. Some cons, sometimes the overall cost of energy savings is fairly small. In other words, if you're an agency and you just want to, hey, we want to be green, we want to show the public we're doing the right thing. We don't want it to cost us money, though, but we're willing to do it at a wash kind of basis. Well, this is often a good way to go to do that. One con is you have very limited control of the PV system on site. You really aren't allowed to touch it at all. And then you do have essentially two utility bills. You're still going to have your utility bill with your utility provider, and then you're going to have a utility bill with this third-party owner. Now, the total of those two bills should be lower than what you were paying before, but when you just had the one, but you do have the two. You'll find that another option that you see out there is a lease. The lease runs in many ways similar to a PPA, except with some key differences. Number one, first of all, with a PPA, there are parts of the country where the utilities do not allow PPAs. Florida is one. Florida does not, most of Florida does not allow the use of a PPA. And the reason being is because they feel that that is competition with the utility. You're basically buying power, you're a utility provider, and the utilities fight that. And so what you have to do is switch to a lease type thing. This is, again, is another way where the system owner, a third-party owner still, can monetize the rebates and incentives. Typically, a lease is around a 15-year term, does usually require down payment, much like you do for a car, if you're leasing a car. But the lease payment is a fixed rate and not tied to the power generated. And that's what separates it from a PPA. In other words, you are saying, all right, I will pay you, I don't know, $10,000 a month for this system. And that's based on the idea that, all right, it's going to produce $11,000 a month in electricity, for example. So it's a good deal in that respect. However, it can't be selling kilowatt hours. So that's why it's not based on just selling it by a kilowatt hour. That's what separates the lease largely from the PPA. So this is still good for government agencies where the PPA is not allowed because, again, it takes relatively minimal upfront cost. And then really the key is both with the PPA and the lease is the system owner is responsible for the O&M, and the landowner, really it comes out of their operating budget and not their capital improvement budget. And that can make a big difference in how this thing is financed. So, all right, we talked about the flip. Coming out of the operations budget versus your capital improvement budget, same kind of thing, where sometimes it's much easier to get to work within your existing operations budget to finance the solar if it's under a PPA type structure, because it really doesn't change your current cost, or in fact may lower your current operations budget, and you don't have to come up with a big chunk of change out of your capital improvement budget. And so that can have a big advantage. So that's pretty much the overall view of some of the key finance options related to solar PV. And before we switch over to Jerry, I'd like to open it up for any questions or that you might have related to it.
I'll offer a couple of comments on the power purchase agreements. I agree with everything you said, but it's actually much more complicated than that.
Much more.
We've explored this whenever you're especially putting up an array the size of 1 megawatt. It requires several acres to house that kind of facility. So you've got the land lease that will be rolled in. I think you pointed that out. But in addition to that, when you're talking about acreage, you're talking about building this array detached from where the load is, which means the electricity has to be dumped onto Encore's distribution system, which means in addition to the 3 cents per kilowatt hour you're paying for that, you're still paying transportation charges to the TDSP. And we've looked at this, I guess, over the past 5 years. We've probably had 5 companies come to the airport, and I've driven them around. I've showed them the tops of parking garages. I've showed them acreage that hadn't been built on. I've offered to enter into power purchase agreements that were indexed to the commercial electric rates that we were getting, and I never see the people again, because they're not willing to put their money into those investments for that long of a period of time for them to get the return they're going to need.
No, that's a good point. You bring up actually a couple of really good points. One is if you're dumping onto the utility at a different location than where your load is. Some utilities won't actually even allow that. They won't even allow you to credit your
Yeah, in this case, they would actually have to become a retail electric provider, which
Right.
nobody wants to do, and I understand that. So what you have to do is enter into an agreement with your existing REP to purchase the energy from the generating source on your behalf, and then you buy it through your normal REP. So again, it's much more complex than just throwing panels up. Now, if you can install these panels on your facility and wire them directly into your infrastructure where they do not hit the utility grid, it's much more simple, and you can actually see a lot of these benefits, but that typically doesn't happen on an array the size of 1 megawatt.
So agreed. Yeah, this is an overall picture. Every site, every project has its specific items that need to be looked at and gone through. You also mentioned the land lease. That can be a real trip hazard for some governments, depending on how that's set up. Often you have to lease it at its true value. Often you can't just lease it at $1 a year, so to speak, to try to make it all work. If you have to actually use the real value, that can have a real impact on the cost too.
That's exactly the way it works at the airport, and
Yeah.
everything that's built on airport property, because most of the land was bought through federal funds, is owned by the airport. So somebody's going to lease the land, they're going to install it, and as this gentleman pointed out, at the end of that lease, it becomes mine. Either that or they have to physically go remove it.
Right.
So,
Right.
This is really more directed towards Encore, and it's community solar arrays. So in a situation such as DFW, could you not make that into a community array where individuals can purchase it, the panels, and receive credits on their bill?
Well, it wouldn't be through Encore because we can't do any generation. So it would have to be either through a generator, a third-party generator, or a retail electric provider. And then we would just provide the lines to get it to wherever it needed to get.
So let's talk.
Be happy to.
Okay, well, with that then.
Sorry, Tony, I was just going to add, and I may be completely off base here on what you're actually asking, but I believe municipal-owned utilities can do community solar, correct?
Oh, yes,
As
ma'am.
long as they're
Yes.
not in Encore territory, and there are some in our region. Garland Power and Light, Weatherford, many on the rural areas. So that is an avenue that COG would like to continue to explore over the next year, is working with our rural co-ops, electric co-ops, to see if we can put together a framework or a template of how to make this work from a community solar perspective that aren't in Encore territory. So that's something definitely that we would like to explore further, so.
Yeah, I'll add on, my comments were reflective of a competitive environment. If you're in a muni or a county co-op that is not in a competitive environment, then I doubt what I said would actually apply to you.
And we are actively involved in a lot of community solar arrays, so we can talk afterwards. Our company's very interested in doing that.
And, as Jacobs, we've done a number of large-scale solar systems that are under PPA arrangements with many, many airports across the country, as well as, government agencies in different cities and everything else. And, for every 5 you look at, maybe 1 is a good candidate. So it really is a case where every single one is different. You have to look at all the specifics related to that site and project and what the requirements are in the utility area that you're in, and all these pieces come together. This by no means was intended to be a 100% complete analysis of how you do it. It's just to give an overview of kind of how the concept works.